Hello. Today we have the great pleasure of starting our second Spiritist Medical Congress by the Spiritist Medical Association with Professor Alexander Moreira-Almeida. It is truly a privilege to have him with us to start our programming. Professor Alexander Moreira-Almeida is a doctor, is associate professor of psychiatry. He's also the director of the Research Center in Spirituality and Health in the University of Medicine at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil. He is the president of the section of spirituality of the Psychiatry Association of Latin America and president of the sessions of religion and psychiatry of the World Psychiatric Association and the Brazilian Psychiatric Association. He concluded his postdoc on health and spirituality at Duke University, United States, and is recognized internationally as a researcher in the area of spirituality and health. So we have the great pleasure to invite Dr. Alexander Moreira-Almeida to kickstart our programming this year. With all of you now, Professor Alexander Moreira-Almeida. Hello, Sonia. Hello, everybody who's watching us. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with colleagues and friends interested in the exploring of this incredible aspect of human life, which is spirituality. One of the great and important points that we will try to explore here is why these spiritual experiences that have always happened throughout our history can tell us about what human beings are, who we are, especially what our mind is, this I, the I that thinks, that feels, that has desires and wishes. What is that? There's a whole discussion to be had if this mind is a product of the brain as a product of electrical chemical reactions, or if it's something beyond that. And so that is our discussion today. And that is one of the greatest challenges from philosophy and science, dating back to ancient Greek, from Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, to nowadays. We continue to explore this great chasm between the brain and the mind. We see the brain working in some electromagnetical functions, and at the same time, we see consciousness on the other side, the I, desires, wishes, feelings, and so forth. So there's objective experience and there's subjective one. What is the relation between both of those? And if you want to go deeper, we also offer a book that we've added a while back. And in time, this book has also been published in Portuguese. But it was also in large part published at the magazine of psychiatric clinical practice in Brazil. Well, so basically, throughout this history, at least in the Western world, there are two fundamental positions. One of those positions is a dualist perspective, which recognizes two fundamental substances, matter and mind, or brain and mind as separate things. The mind will be something, and the brain will be another. And the brain will be the instrument, the filter that allows for the manifestation of the mind in this physical existence. The second approach, which is the monist or materialistic proposal, and materialistic because it relates to matter and is reductionist in the sense of reducing the mind as a function of the brain. According to William James, a doctor, philosopher, he would call this the theory of production, that the brain produces the mind. And the other one would be transmission theory. So these are the two main positions that we find throughout our history. often we also hear it be claimed that there's a fact that the brain produces the mind. For instance, Francis Crick, who was a great investigator that explored the human genome and has a book, for instance, published in which he says his being, his memories, his sorrows, its person, its free will, that all of these are nothing but the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So basically, we're just a bunch of molecules in our brain moving around. And that is the materialist position. There'll be nothing beyond that, according to that theory. The great challenge that this proposal brings, and that we have some neurons and all of a sudden we have consciousness, we run into a problem that can be called sometimes the explanatory gap, according to Chalmers. And so there is a gap between what we see in the brain and in the mind. We are unable to explain within this materialistic perspective how, and we even see the cartoon here, but how this can happen as if it were magic. Could we see that trick again? Is almost as something, it's portrayed as something obvious, but it's hard to truly understand. It's almost like magic. So, interestingly, to explain this gap or to claim this position, supposedly scientific position, many scientists put forth that the brain generates the mind, much the same way that the liver produces bilis, or so there are other metaphors that are used with organs and functions and so forth. And so this is put forth as if it was something new. But this pattern of analogies and metaphors is not recent to the 20th century. The historian philosopher Saulo de Freitas Araújo shows us that these are patterns that go back to the French materialist approach to the 18th century, and it has at least 300 years of age. And these 300 years, the strategy in rhetorics has been to say science clearly proves that the brain produces the mind, although that has never really shown. And these analogies continue to be used. But when we ask, how does the brain produce the mind? What kind of evidence do you have that the brain produces the consciousness? And the answer generally is science is advancing, and soon enough we are going to discover it. The answer is about to come. The strategy of putting it to the future to have that answer was called by different people, including Karl Popper, as a promissory materialist, as you're issuing a promissory note, hoping that it will pay in the future. But it never really gets to explain. It's almost like prophecy, like faith, that this eventually will be solved. But for 300 years, we have been waiting for this promise. And we say, genome was going to show it, the neuroimaging was going to show it, but we've been waiting for it. And in a general way, we often ask, what kind of evidences do we have that we are only a product of physical or chemical reactions of the brain? Well, three patterns are often put forth. First, the neural correlates. That is, I think about the love that I have for my wife, and then I have mental activity. I have a perception of pain, and I have another part of my brain activated. And so it's interpreted that the ultimate cause of this existence is the brain. The other second area of evidence is this brain damage. There's a case of Phineas Gage that suffered a damage as if a spear had crossed his frontal lobe, and he survived. But his personality was severely changed as a result. And we also know, for instance, in Alzheimer's, how it affects memory. And so if my brain is damaged and that function no longer manifests, we understand that ultimately the cause of that function was in the brain. And at last, we also have the idea of cerebral stimulation. So if I stimulate an area, then I have actions. And that proves that all these different experiences will be the result of that stimulation. Or if I offer medication and stimulate that area, it triggers a reaction. But these three findings can be explained by the production model that the brain produces the mind, but it can also be explained by the filtered model. An analogy here, for instance, is the TV set or the screen that you're now using to see this. When I was a child, I thought that the cartoon characters lived inside the TV because I saw them there. When I was older, I found out they didn't live in there. That TV set, it was just a receiving end of a product that was created somewhere else. So, in that same manner, we can compare. So let's take, for instance, these three cases that we talked about. So on the neural correlates, I can find the neural correlates and show me that in that area of the brain is connected to that function. But it doesn't mean that is the ultimate cause of that. For instance, in the TV, I can see the image that I see and the acting of the circuits in the TV, but it doesn't show that the cause of the programs are in those circuits. It only shows that to see the program on TV in that format, I need those circuits. But if I damage those circuits, if I destroy my TV, I am going to hurt my ability to see the program. But it doesn't necessarily mean it destroys the original program. Much the same way you might not like my talk right now and you might break your screen, but I will continue to exist. And that talk will continue to exist and it will be able to be seen in elsewhere, in other places. And at the end, we also have the cerebral stimulation. When we stimulate an area, we can only show that that is connected to the experience of that relation. So, for instance, if I live my preoccipital lobe, I see the lights, but it doesn't mean that all the lights that I see have an external light or that it be an illusion in my brain. That is to say, these phenomena of neural correlates, brain lesions, and brain stimulation are not enough to separate whether the brain is an organ that manifests the mind or if it actually produces the mind. And that is very important. In fact, this has been a knowledge in centuries, for centuries. Many authors have acted on this. Even William James himself has claimed that this can be explained either way. Another interesting case is from Wilbur Penfield, one of the great pioneers of neuroscience. And he studied the brains of living people during surgery who were awake, conscious, but under local anesthesia. And he would stimulate different areas of the brain to find out what kind of functions he had to perform his surgeries. And he believed, started off as a monist. But after decades of study and hundreds of patients stimulated, he became a dualist. And he said, listen, there is no brain area that I can stimulate and then they will have a great reflection, a great idea, new idea. No. So suggesting that effectively that these superior functions are not specifically produced only by brain activity. And they call it the mystery of mind, which you can read. So show that these supposed claims or evidence that the brain generates the mind are very fragile. In truth, an interesting idea that oftentimes could also be an equivocation is that we accept this monism, this materialist. And it's not true that everything points to that. There is a long tradition of philosophers and scientists who are not reductionists or physicalists. In fact, uh, this was a predominant until the 19th century. So, for instance, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle's, going through by the founders of psychology, such as William James, or the scientific method of Francis Bacon, or Penfield, I talked about, or Eccles, who won a Nobel Prize, and other philosophers as well. Well, so we have a very different perspective. And we think that there is a unanimity of thought, that we think that everybody has proved that, but that's not always the case. He also had a non physicalist vision. And today, even among many psychiatrists, we see that. Here's a poll that we did in with 600 psychiatrists, and we asked them, and if we asked them if the mind, the I, the self, is a product of brains, and it was half and half, and almost 50-50. So that serves to show that even psychiatrists and doctors who study the mind and behavior scientifically, there is not a unanimity or a dominance of one idea over another. Another interesting perspective, too, is we carried out a study on how the most important magazines of psychiatry in the world approached this topic, brain, mind. And very interestingly, we find very few articles that touched on the brain. But these very few artists were published by very important authors. And every article had a high level of citations, over 100 each. However, unfortunately, the great majority of these articles represented many misrepresentations of the problem, not representing what truly is studied in the field. For instance, a very common theme is the criticism to dualism. For instance, that the idea dualist is the product of superstition, and that no learned person can truly accept it. And of course, that is very false. We have showed actually how many scientists and very learned people have accepted it. And also, the idea that this Cartesian dualism would separate the mind from the body, and it would not allow for the interaction, the mind with the body, the psychosomatics, for instance, or to value our emotions and so forth. So this obviously is false, since Descartes, who proposed a functional dualism, that the brain influences the mind influences the brain, the emotions connected, and that interchange of information between mind and brain. Another fact that's often claimed is that this issue has already been provided by physicalism as the truth, and that's also not the case. And we say, oh, this has been proved, and we moved on. There isn't a serious discussion about the topic. There's just a claim. And a lot of people, it's often said that a lot of psychiatrists also accept physicalist approach, and that's not necessarily true. They have sometimes been misrepresented. So the great challenge or risk in academic environment is the premature conclusion of a question. And so from thousands of years from a philosophical perspective, the challenge is to us erroneously and rushed to close this question as solved, and claim that it has answered the challenge, and that prevents the true exploration of the topic. And so what we propose is a pluralism of theories. And because we don't have enough scientific evidence to fully provide one explanation, it's necessary for us to create the liberty for different people to present different possibilities, various hypotheses, and varying paradigms, and so that science can test these options and find out which one is best, as opposed to approaching a dogmatic posture of prohibiting, for instance, such as exposure of a spiritualist or dualist, that we can be more than our physical body, independent of our physical bodies. That is to say, that is a legitimate position that should and could be discussed. An interesting point I would like to visit that I think is very important is that people confuse naturalism with physicalism and say, if I understand naturalism as the study of nature and what exists, it does not necessarily means that it's physicalism. Physicalism is the presupposing that there is only matter and that everything has to be explained through these particles and forces. Physicalism is not essential to science. In fact, science, modern science, and Francis Bacon, Kepler, Newton, Galileo, Robert Boyle, all of these founders were physicalists, for instance. Pasteur, none of them were physicalists. So physicalism is not a required component of science. And it does not come from scientific evidence either. It's a presupposed idea. So we cannot impose this concept to other people. And oftentimes, we see a materialist scientificism, which we present materialism, physicalism, as a scientific fact and claim that it explains all things, even the meaning of life or ethics, and claim that all of this can come from this materialistic explanation. And we have to be careful about that. And before anything else in science, we must have mental and intellectual humility and recognize that we do not know all the components of the universe. And if there's something that we have to learn, we can. And oftentimes we find scientists in many different ages, they have figured out everything that had to be figured out. But that's not the case. For instance, Lord Kelvin, at the end of the 19th century, he had claimed that science had come to learn everything in the universe, and there are now only small adjustments to be made. A few years later, we see the theory of relativity with Einstein, and sometimes we call it Kelvinite, this illness of Lord Kelvin, a certain scientific arrogance. And we should ask ourselves, who can truly claim that they know everything that there is out in the universe and that there's nothing else that has not been explored? So to say that we can know everything that exists is a very difficult matter. I and other authors, we propose the idea of an expanded naturalism. That is to say that nature is composed of matter, but also of mind. The mind would be another irreducible element that cannot be deconstructed into something else. Thomas Nagel, one of the very important philosopher of actuality, in the book Mind and Cosmos, says that perhaps the natural world is not exclusively physical. And my guiding conviction is that my mind is a basic aspect of nature, a name, mind, soul, whatever you want to call it. There is an independent support for the step to such an enlarged conception of reality. So that's one of the possibilities, and that's where we work towards, and perhaps most of us in the symposium thinks that way too. But we have already commented that what is it that could provide us more clear and robust evidence that mind is independent of matter? We have seen before those three areas that claim to be evidence that the brain generates the mind are unable to separate the perspectives. But what could help us in many different ways is the spiritual or religious experiences. Why? Why? These experiences are almost always are connected to an idea of transcendence, the fundamental concept of spirituality, that there is a transcendent reality, that there is a reality outside this physical world in which we live. And this contact with the transcendent reality is what creates these experiences. For instance, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, of remote viewing or viewing at a deathbed, or the viewing of somebody who has passed already, or the experience of being in contact with God or spiritual beings, we find that in all cultures, in all traditions. So these experiences may afford us two approaches. The most reductionist approach says that these realities, that these experiences, they don't have an ontological reality. They say they've been in contact with a transcendent reality and that they saw themselves out of their body, or that they talked to a relative that has passed. It could not have happened. They could have interpreted, but that doesn't exist. Ontologically speaking, they claim it's false. So, what is their posture? Either we ignore that, which happens throughout the 20th century, medicine, psychology, or even science of religion have ignored these experiences, or provide explanations that disqualify the experiences, or basically explain it away. For instance, oh no, that was a hallucination, for instance, or is a cognitive distortion, or is a psychological problem, or is a social cultural construction. All these explanations that can partially explain these spiritual experiences, but do they explain all experiences with no residues? And the materialist then is forced to explain it this way because a priori he's prohibiting himself from thinking ontologically about the experience. And who says that? Is Chesterfield, who says, who's a Catholic thinker from the former century, and used to say, materialism restricts a person because people are then forced to see spiritual experience only from a physical perspective. And while spiritualists can see that that phenomena could be an illusion, but they are not closed to the possibility that that indeed could have been a transcendent experience. And so those who are attached to the dogmatic approach to preconceived notions are generally those who embrace a physicalist approach. So physicalists will imagine these experiences are not possible, but they also take into consideration their ontological reality. And so we think that these spiritual realities, experiences, suggest an empirical base to test these different hypotheses that the mind exists beyond the brain. In fact, there's a long tradition in this area. We have an article here from our friend Carlos Alvarado, a very large number of scientists and investigators recognized of renown that have studied this phenomenon in the last 150 years, raising the possibility that they indicate an extra-physic dimension for human beings, including some who have earned Nobel Prizes, such as Carl Richer, Marie Curie, and so forth. And the most interesting piece to understand these experiences, medium mystic experiences, trance experiences, have been very important to help us understand the mind. Many of the ideas that we have, subliminal mind, in unconscious, dissociation, hysteria, have arisen from these spiritualist experiences. And here are some classic books that touch this topic that may be known by many people in the area of the history of psychology and psychiatry. As I have said before, William James will tell us that the theory of transmission, that the brain is only a filter to receive a transmission from the mind that comes from a different source, is the best explanation over the hypothesis of protection, because he says that this filter theory explains better all these different spiritual experiences that are often ignored within the materialist approach. It says an ample class of experiences that are hardly explained by the theory of production. These phenomena who are unclear and exceptional, related in all times throughout human history. They've always existed. There's no culture that have not relayed some of those religious conversions, spontaneous healings, premonitions, apparitions at the time of death, visions or clairvoyant visions, mediumistic abilities. These are very paradoxical experiences that have no meaning on the production theory, but naturally fit the other theory. We need to at least presuppose a continuity of consciousness. That is, science can never close its eyes then to this possibility. I cannot just cut pieces of reality to fit my theory. I need to expand my theory to adapt it to reality. Otherwise, I would have to chop somebody's leg to make sure that they fit in the bed. And contrary to what is believed, there's a lot of studies, academically speaking, of magazines of renown about experiences that suggest the possibility of consciousness beyond the brain. And so a systematic revision of the literature, and that we found over almost 2,000 papers about these different experiences, near-death experience, medium mistake, previous lives, memories, and so forth. And these experiences, and have been articles published and published in magazines of renown. So there is a wide range of material. And the area that's most studied, for instance, is that of near-death experiences. So these various experiences, mediumistic, near-death experiences, out-of-body, previous lives, have many different experiences. Fraud, hallucinations, cognitive distortions, inconscient mental activity, ESP, like telepathy or clairvoyance, or an independence of mind. And so we'll go quickly through some of these experiences. For instance, the experience of near-death experience, we have two articles that we brought forth from Peter Fenwick and also from Mario Beauregard and Natalie Trent von Hasler that discuss that the near-death experiences, for our topic today specifically, it's very interesting. Why? Oh, for instance, in situations such as like cardiac arrests or very grave clinical situations in which the brain is not being oxygenated properly, does not receive the glucose at adequate levels, or the brain is not working at all, such as a cardiac stop, for instance, arrest. Within the physicalist approach, if the function of the brain creates the mind, then the mind will be completely hurt or completely abolished during that cardiac arrest. However, many patients relate that they were not only lucid, but more lucid than they normally are. And even more interesting, these experiences does not depend on their culture, their religion, their mental health status, the hypoxia or not, the number of medicines used or not. Nothing of that explains these experiences. Another interesting fact that is not only are these experiences transcultural, but Schumann produced a work, for instance, that analyzed people from antiquity, from native peoples, and many different parts of the world, also present very similar narratives, showing that it's not only a social construct. And more interestingly, there are also many narratives of perceptions that are the description of things that have actually happened during their cardiac arrest. They describe what was talked within the room, what was objects in the room, knowledge that the person could not have had via physical means since they were mentally inactive. And sometimes they narrate that they saw that from a different perspective, like from the ceiling and so forth. And that's a very interesting set of evidence that talks about the persistence of the mind. Another interesting fact, too, is that we have been able to compare the quality of these memories with the memory of a real event. And in the people who had the near-death experience, the memories in near-death experience were more vigorous, they were more vivacious and characteristics of a real memory than that they had of real events. So they had a hyper real memory. So you can say how those people really received the real reality of the world. So another piece of evidence that suggests that these memories are not just imagination. So moving to a different area, for instance, when we talk about experience of mediumship, in which people claim they have perceptions or be under control of a personality that is different than theirs. Well, first, many studies have carried out these studies and shown that people who have visual, auditive perceptions during trance, they don't have a compromised mental health state. Actually, the opposite. Oftentimes, they can be better than the traditional reason they were not in a psychotic state and so forth. So there is no relation between the intensity of this mediumistic phenomena and mental health. Actually, quite the opposite. More of these experiences generally correlate with a better mental health study. And that's a very interesting study coordinated by Julie Paris and our group. And we analyzed the brain of mediums during psychography or automatic writing. We analyzed the content of the message and the activity of their brain, and also when they were also in a normal state of consciousness, just writing a regular text. And what called our attention was that with most experienced mediums, the texts were produced were more complex when analyzed by specialists than they would otherwise would be able to do during normal states of mind. And it would say, if it were the brain who was producing this text, we would find more brain activity. And in fact, we find the opposite. And the most experienced mediums, during this moment of psychography or automatic writing, we actually find a drop in their activity levels in the areas that are important to create the rational thought, which is compatible with the narrative from mediums that claim that they are not the ones producing the messages. And there are many studies, in fact, about the content of these mediumistic experiences. Could we explain it through fraud or coincidence and all these findings? And this is a revision that we did a couple of years ago, showing that there is a very robust level of information, of truthful information about this this personality in the beyond who transmits it to the medium. And sometimes, too, mediums will exhibit abilities that they themselves have not learned, but who are compatible with the personalities of the so-called deceased, from painting to literary styles, for instance. There's a Brazilian medium, famous Francis Xavier, that published hundreds of poems and of different poets. And there are academic studies and showing the high level of stylistic similitude between the mediumistic poems and the poems by the real authors. Sometimes even the calligraphy. And Francis Xavier had very little schooling. And this year, we have also seen a production of a review of studies with great controls about mediumistic communications. Basically, when mediums acquire information, they are not in contact with parents of other people so that they don't leak that information. And that information is then checked by other people as well. And so they do not know who the information is for. And this time of blind approach, look at this proxy sitters, this systematic review of 18 different studies found an effect size that suggests that on average, these studies, the most well-produced with controls in place, that the rate of of right hits is statistically significant above that of occasional or occurrence. And we also have some more detailed studies of qualitative studies that go deep. For instance, the letters of the Brazilian medium we cited, Francis Xavier. There's a study in which we studied 13 different letters that were attributed to the same person, a deceased person. There were 99 different items verifiable, and the letter and the name of people, facts, and so forth. And all these items were not communicated to the mediums, but the great majority were clear hits in a good way. Another interesting study that's produced recently in a good and important magazine, we also study the case of a different psychographed letter, and we see the precision level from describing an accident a person underwent to childhood facts of the deceased, facts about their relationships with parents, and sometimes facts that even the familiars, the parents, family members themselves did not know at first. So another fact, another data point of mediumistic experiences that are suggestive to the fact that the consciousness can manifest after the death of the physical body. And at the end, another line of study, this is a new article that we have published. A student of ours as well, and other people from our group, we underwent a revision of existing literature about scientific articles published in a great database, academic database, about the experiences that allege to be recalling past life memories. And these studies as well have also picked up speed in the past 5 decades, also published in many different types of academic magazines. And in general, they narrate children who are able to recall a previous life. As soon as they are able to talk, they start to reference these past lives. And on average, they talk about 20 different claims. They generally refer to a violent death. And oftentimes, when you go investigate those data, they are solvable cases that can be validated. And oftentimes, these children have phobias and fears that are not explainable by this life and their experiences in this life, but are compatible with the experiences that they allege to have had from previous lives. And some of them have even post-traumatic stress disorders, not found in this life, but originated in the previous lives, and also have personality traits that are connected to this claimed past personality. And birthmarks oftentimes as well that correlate to the type of death from a previous life. For instance, if they were shot in the heart in a previous life, sometimes they will find a birthmark in that same area, even though they may not have had contact with that previous life or a family of the previous personality. Other data that suggests that the consciousness survives physical death. Parallel to this, we also find evidence, or at least published evidence, of extrasensorial perceptions, telepathy or clairvoyance, or seeing objects at a distance. That is reviewed by Professor Edsel Cardenha from Lund University in Sweden, that was published by the American Psychologist, one of the most important magazines from the American Psychological Association, that reviewed the available literature and concluded that the evidence for the reality of these phenomena cannot be explained only by fraud, selective reporting, experimental or analytical incompetence. That the evidence for psi is comparable to that of for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. And that's very hard to explain it away with mental activity and other things. Because of that, many different authors, and I'm a part of that group, are bringing forth a more ample vision for nature and a manifesto for a post-materialist science. The science does not need to go just into materialism. This is not about denying what materialistic science shows us. It's just a claim that perhaps that is not enough and that it requires an ample study of all aspects. And that's the call of the moment. So, in conclusion, materialistic visions that are reductionist, that the brain causes the mind, have grave objections both from a philosophical and empirical perspective. There is no definite proof in science and physics, chemistry, and so forth. We can accumulate evidence from one place or another, but it seems to us that very robustly that the evidence that we have, and I only presented a really brief panorama, are very suggestive to the idea that the mind is something beyond the brain, that it may persist beyond the brain. And from a scientific perspective, this problem remains open, and so we defend the possibility that the mind-soul is a irreducible concept in the universe, and within a true academic environment, we must have the liberty to work and put forth candidates for new paradigms without a dogmatic approach, to separate true science from scientific dogmatic approach. What we propose in science is a Darwinian competition of paradigms, that the most apt paradigm should survive and not exclude some a priori, to let all the other possibilities run together until we can explain these experiences, that they should be tested with all rigor, and the empirical evidence and scientific evidence should prevail. So theories and over ideologies. And so we need to collect all the data from human experience and not just cut specific pieces that fit into our theories. So I want to thank you all for your attention. If you'd like to dive deeper into this discussion of science and spirituality, we have a channel on YouTube called TV Noobs. Here is the address. It's both in Portuguese and in English, with hundreds of videos for researchers from different areas that talk about the question of science, spirituality, and health. Here's our contact information as well, social, and we are also putting forth new information with new research and reflections around science and spirituality. So thank you very much.